There is a very quiet assumption hiding behind the way this topic is usually spoken about. It is the assumption that growth, of any kind, must look like movement forward, that there is somewhere else to be, that whatever is happening now is, in some subtle way, insufficient. And when the word spiritual is added to that assumption, it becomes even more delicate, because it sounds noble, it sounds clean. It sounds like the mind has found a reason to justify its restlessness. After all, if one says, "I want more money," the tension is obvious. If one says, "I want more status," the hunger is exposed. But if one says, "I want to grow spiritually," the same tension can hide behind softer language. It can disguise itself as sincerity, as depth, as seriousness, and so it often goes unnoticed. Meanwhile, something quite different is happening in places where growth is never discussed at all. A tree, for example, does not wake up in the morning wondering whether it is spiritually advanced compared to the trees around it. It does not measure its rings against yesterday's version of itself. It does not feel behind schedule. It simply responds to light, to water, to seasons, without an internal commentary about progress. And yet, it grows. This contrast is curious because the human mind, which is capable of extraordinary subtlety, often struggles to leave growth alone. It turns it into a project. It turns it into a direction with a map, checkpoints, and imagined destinations. And once something becomes a destination, it can also become a distance. Something that is not here yet. Something that the present moment is compared against. At this point, a metaphor naturally appears, not because it is clever, but because it is ordinary. Imagine walking on a path while holding a mirror in front of your face, constantly checking whether you look like someone who is walking well. You may still move forward, but your attention is split. The walking becomes secondary to the evaluation of the walking. And over time, the mirror quietly becomes more important than the path itself. When spiritual growth becomes a goal, something similar can occur. The experience of being alive is no longer enough on its own. It must be filtered through a question. Is this helping me grow? Even silence is measured. Even peace is inspected. Even confusion is judged by whether it is a good kind of confusion or a failure to understand properly. The metaphor stretches further if you stay with it, because once there is a goal, there is also an imagined version of the self who has arrived, a calmer self, a wiser self, a less reactive self, and this imagined self begins to cast a shadow over the current one. The present experience is subtly placed on trial. It is no longer just what is happening. It is evidence of how far one still has to go. This is where identity begins to harden around the idea of becoming. The sense of me quietly shifts from being whatever is happening now into a narrative about improvement. The ego, which is remarkably adaptable, learns new language. It stops saying, "I am better than others," and starts saying, "I am more aware." It stops saying, "I have achieved," and starts saying, "I am on a path." The structure remains. Only the vocabulary changes. And with that structure comes tension, though it may not feel dramatic at first. It can feel like sincerity mixed with pressure, like dedication mixed with subtle disappointment. Because every moment that does not match the image of growth becomes a problem to solve. Emotions are no longer visitors. They are indicators. Thoughts are no longer movements of the mind. They are obstacles or signs of regression. In everyday life, this shows up quietly. At work, one notices irritation and immediately wonders why it is still there. In relationships, one feels jealousy or distance and thinks it should have been transcended by now. Time itself begins to feel like a scoreboard. After all this effort, the mind whispers, shouldn't things feel different? The present moment, instead of being lived, is assessed. What makes this especially subtle is that none of it feels wrong in an obvious way. It feels responsible. It feels intentional. It feels like taking life seriously. And yet, Something has tightened. Something has become narrower. The field of experience is no longer open-ended. It is framed by expectation. The question is no longer simply, what is happening? But, what does this say about me? This is not a dramatic failure. It is not a mistake that needs correction. It is simply what happens when a living process is turned into an object to be pursued. When movement is measured from the inside. When awareness starts watching itself too closely. And already, without drawing any conclusions, it becomes possible to sense how effort, even gentle effort, can quietly turn against the very openness it was meant to honor. If you stay with this gently, without trying to fix it or name it too quickly, another detail begins to appear. It has to do with time. Goals, by their nature, live in the future. Even when they are abstract, even when they are inward, they borrow their gravity from what is not yet here. And the moment spiritual growth is placed there, something subtle happens to the present moment. It becomes a means. Now, the present is very patient. It does not complain when it is used as a stepping stone. It does not protest when it is treated as preparation. But it does quietly change its character in our perception. Instead of being the place where life is happening, it becomes the place where life is supposed to be improving. You can notice this not in grand philosophical moments, but in very small ones. Sitting alone, doing nothing in particular, there may be a faint sense that this stillness should be doing something to you, that it should be calming you more deeply, dissolving something, revealing something. And if it does not, the stillness feels incomplete, almost wasted. Compare this with something entirely non-human again, something ordinary. A cat lying in the sun does not consider whether the warmth is productive. It does not wonder if it will remember this warmth later as part of its development. The experience is not framed as input toward an outcome. It is simply what is happening. And when it ends, it ends. The human mind, however, has learned to hover over experience like an accountant. It keeps quiet records. It tallies insights. It remembers moments that felt expansive, and then looks for them again. And in that search, the original openness is replaced by memory and expectation. What once arrived unexpectedly is now demanded. Here the metaphor shifts slightly. Imagine listening to music, but instead of hearing the sound, you are waiting for the part that moved you last time. You recognize the melody, you anticipate the peak, and when it comes, it is compared to a remembered version. Was it as strong? Was it as clear? Was it the same? The music is still playing, but you are no longer fully there with it. When spiritual growth becomes a goal, awareness can begin to listen to itself in this way. Attention turns inward, but not with curiosity, with monitoring, with comparison. The question underneath is rarely spoken aloud, but it is felt. Is this it? And when that question appears, experience subtly contracts. Not because anything is wrong, but because it is being checked against an image. This is where identity becomes especially clever. The sense of self begins to organize around being someone who is growing, someone who understands, someone who has seen through certain illusions. And once that identity forms, it needs maintenance. It needs consistency. Certain thoughts become embarrassing. Certain emotions feel out of place. They threaten the story. Anxiety, at this point, does not announce itself as fear. It appears as vigilance. A quiet watchfulness over one's own reactions. A subtle self-correction happening almost in real time. Anger arises and is immediately questioned. Sadness appears and is quickly interpreted. Even joy is sometimes inspected, as if to make sure it is not attachment in disguise. This vigilance can feel like depth. It can feel like refinement. But it carries a tension that is hard to name, because it does not shout. It hums. It is the tension of holding oneself slightly away from what is happening in order to see it properly. Of turning experience into an object while still standing inside it. In ordinary life, This tension shows up in fatigue that has no clear cause, in the sense that one is always a little late to the moment. Conversations feel half-lived, because part of the attention is watching how one is showing up. Time feels compressed, as if there is always something to catch up to, even in moments that are meant to be restful. What is curious is that the original impulse towards spiritual growth often begins as a response to suffering, to confusion, to the feeling that life is being lived on the surface. And yet, when that impulse hardens into a goal, it can recreate a similar kind of suffering, only more refined. Less dramatic, but more constant. Less obvious, but more intimate. None of this requires judgment. It does not suggest that seeking understanding is wrong, or that reflection is a mistake. It simply points to a pattern the mind tends to follow. A pattern of turning fluid processes into solid achievements, of replacing openness with orientation, of trading immediacy for progress. And somewhere in the background of all this, life continues to happen. Dishes are washed, emails are answered, bodies get tired, people disappoint each other. None of these things wait for insight to mature. None of them pause while awareness checks its own alignment. They arrive, as they always have, without asking whether they fit the narrative of growth. If you let that sink in without rushing forward, it becomes possible to sense a quiet irony here. The more attention is placed on becoming something else, the more strained the relationship with what is already present. And the strain itself becomes another thing to work through, another sign that something is not finished yet. Still, nothing needs to be resolved. There is no conclusion hiding here. Only a widening view of how easily the mind can turn even its most sincere movements into something to manage. And how, in doing so, it may overlook the simplicity that was never absent, only unremarked. There is a point, if you linger long enough with this, where the effort to grow begins to feel strangely heavy. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just slightly dense. As if something transparent has slowly thickened. And often, this heaviness is interpreted as resistance, or a lesson not yet learned, rather than as a signal about the way attention itself has been arranged. Because what is rarely questioned is the posture of the observer, the stance from which all this growth is being evaluated. The assumption is that there is a stable position inside from which one can look at experience, measure it, and move it along. But that position, that inner manager, is itself part of what is happening. It is not outside the flow. It is another movement within it. Imagine trying to smooth water with your hand. The intention is gentle, the movement is careful, and yet, the very act of trying to make the surface still creates ripples. Not because the water is resisting you, but because it responds to touch. In the same way, consciousness responds to being handled too deliberately. It becomes textured. It becomes busy in subtle ways. When spiritual growth becomes a goal, perception starts touching itself like this. Awareness is no longer simply aware. It is aware of being aware, and then aware of how well that awareness is functioning. This layering does not feel artificial at first. It feels intelligent, reflexive. But over time, it introduces a faint separation between the experience and the experiencing of it. This separation is where rigidity quietly settles in, not as dogma, but as preference. Certain states are favored. Certain insights are trusted more than others. The mind learns which feelings seem elevated and which feel regressive. And without anyone intending it, a hierarchy forms, not between people, but between experiences. Calm feels better than agitation. Spaciousness feels better than contraction. Detachment feels more advanced than longing. And once these preferences are in place, the nervous system learns them too. It begins to tense at the arrival of what is considered less evolved. It tightens around anger. It braces against confusion. It rushes past boredom. This is where anxiety quietly deepens. Not the obvious kind, but the kind that comes from maintaining an image, from needing experience to confirm a certain understanding of oneself. The question underneath everything becomes, am I still aligned? And alignment, once it becomes something to maintain, becomes fragile. In ordinary moments, this can feel like a subtle impatience with oneself, a sense that reactions are taking too long to dissolve, that old patterns are resurfacing when they shouldn't. The word should slip in unnoticed. This shouldn't bother me anymore. I thought I was past this. And suddenly, the present moment is no longer neutral ground. It is evidence for or against a story. What makes this especially elusive is that it often appears alongside genuine insight. Real clarity may have occurred. Certain illusions may have loosened. Certain fears may have softened. And yet, the mind takes these moments and turns them into reference points, landmarks on a map, proof of direction. And once that happens, the freshness of insight is replaced by memory. Here the metaphor shifts again, almost on its own. It is like trying to keep a flame alive by grabbing it. The warmth was never meant to be held. It was meant to be felt. And when you try to secure it, it flickers or burns or disappears entirely. Not because it is fragile, but because it does not belong to possession. Identity struggles here because it wants continuity. It wants to say, this is who I am now. It wants stability and understanding. And so it freezes moments of clarity into concepts. It builds an internal resume, not to impress others, but to reassure itself, to know where it stands. Time plays an interesting role in this. The past becomes a storehouse of meaningful moments. The future becomes a horizon of expected refinement. And the present, again, becomes the narrow bridge between them. Something to cross, rather than inhabit. Even now, even here, attention may already be leaning forward, anticipating what this reflection is leading toward. And yet, life does not organize itself that way. It does not unfold according to improvement curves. It does not reward effort with permanent states. It moves in cycles, fluctuations, returns. Clarity comes and goes. Ease appears and fades. None of it stays long enough to become an identity without distortion. In relationships, this rigidity can quietly interfere. Listening becomes filtered through self-awareness. One notices how patient one is being, how present one appears. Moments of irritation feel out of character and are either suppressed or overanalyzed. Authenticity becomes careful, and careful authenticity is already a contradiction. At work, the same pattern appears. Stress is no longer just stress. It is a failure to integrate understanding. Deadlines feel like spiritual tests. Fatigue feels like a lack of alignment. The ordinary pressures of living are subtly moralized. They become reflections of inner work not yet complete. None of this means anything has gone wrong. It simply shows how easily the mind turns inward exploration into a structure, how quickly fluid awareness can be shaped into an ideal, and how, once that happens, tension is almost inevitable not as punishment, but as physics. Because wherever there is an image to maintain, there is effort, and wherever there is effort, there is strain, even if the effort is gentle, even if it is well-intentioned, even if it wears the language of wisdom. If you let this sit without trying to extract meaning from it, something else begins to soften. Not a conclusion, not an answer, just a loosening of the grip. A sense that the very need to manage the process may be part of what keeps it from breathing. And in that softening, the question of growth begins to feel less urgent, less central. Not because it has been resolved, but because it no longer occupies the entire field of attention. There is something almost tender about the moment when this urgency fades, not because anything has been achieved, but because the pressure to arrive somewhere loosens its hold. And what becomes noticeable then is not a new insight, but a different relationship with what is already here. When spiritual growth is no longer leaned toward as a goal, experience begins to lose its evaluative weight. Thoughts still appear. Emotions still move through the body. Reactions still happen. But they are not immediately asked to justify themselves. They are not measured against an internal standard of progress. They are allowed to be temporary without being interpreted. This is not indifference. It is closer to familiarity, like recognizing the sound of rain without needing it to mean anything beyond rain. The mind, which had been slightly perched above experience, watching and adjusting, begins to settle back into it. Not as a technique, not as a practice, but as a natural consequence of not needing to supervise. Here, the metaphor almost dissolves on its own, because once attention is no longer trying to shape itself, it becomes less interested in images altogether. The idea of a more evolved self loses some of its brightness, not because it is rejected, but because it is no longer necessary. The present moment does not need to lead somewhere else in order to be complete in itself. Identity, which had been wrapped around becoming, relaxes its grip. The sense of me is no longer anchored in direction. It does not need to be on a path. It can simply be a point of view through which life is passing. This does not make it disappear. It makes it lighter, less defended. Time changes texture here as well. The future stops pulling quite so hard. The past loses some of its authority. Memories of insight are no longer instructions. They are just memories. And the now, which had been so narrow under the pressure of progress, widens again. It feels less like a checkpoint and more like a field. In everyday life, this shows up in very ordinary ways. A difficult conversation does not immediately become a spiritual problem. Fatigue is just fatigue. Irritation is just irritation. There is no rush to translate these experiences into lessons or failures. They are allowed to come and go without commentary. This does not mean awareness disappears. If anything, it becomes quieter, less performative, less self-conscious. It is no longer standing in front of a mirror, asking how it looks. It is more like a room with the lights on, nothing dramatic, just enough illumination for things to be seen as they are. And because nothing is being demanded of experience, experience begins to move more freely. Emotions complete themselves without interference. Thoughts lose some of their stickiness. Not because they are controlled, but because they are no longer being watched for signs of progress or regression. What is perhaps most striking here is how little needs to be said about it. The mind, which had been narrating its own journey, finds fewer reasons to speak. Silence is no longer something to deepen. It is just the absence of noise. Presence is no longer something to cultivate. It is simply what remains when there is nothing to fix. Spiritual growth, in this light, looks less like a staircase and more like weather. It happens. It changes. It cannot be owned. Trying to make it permanent only obscures its nature. Letting it move as it does reveals that it was never separate from ordinary life to begin with. Work continues. Relationships continue. Loss still hurts. Joy still surprises. None of these are transcended. None of them are elevated into something else. They are lived directly, without needing to confirm an identity or fulfill a direction. And perhaps that is the quiet turn here, not a conclusion, not a teaching, but a shift in orientation. When growth stops being a goal, life stops being a project. It becomes something closer to a conversation, unpredictable, sometimes awkward, sometimes clear, always unfinished. There is no final state waiting beyond this, no resolution to hold on to. Just the simple, ongoing movement of experience, unburdened by the need to become something other than what it already is. And in that absence of pressure, there is a subtle ease, not an achievement, not a reward, just the relief of not having to arrive anywhere at all.